Welcome to Home Gym History. On this episode, I'm going to explore the history of arm wrestling. People have been arm wrestling each other since ancient times. Over those thousands of years and these, who knows, millions of arm wrestling matches, it's become more organized. And I have the perfect guest, Eric Roussin, from the Facebook page Arm Wrestling Archives, to talk about the history of arm wrestling. I met Eric at a grip strength competition, Heavy Hands, a couple months ago, and we got to talking, and he told me about all this research that he'd done about the history of arm wrestling, and I thought, well, this is the guy. I got to get him on the podcast. So please stick around to hear about the history of arm wrestling from Eric Roussin. But first, indulge me with one more reminder about Home Gym Con. It's coming up the last weekend of April, the gathering of home gym owners with all of the companies that they love putting out the equipment and the weights and the barbells and the things that they want to see in person. And that's all occurring at French Lick Resort in French Lick, Indiana, the last weekend of April. If you don't have tickets yet, you can save some money by using code VINTAGE, as in Vintage Weights PGH. So please consider using code VINTAGE when you purchase your tickets to Home Gym Con, and it'll save you a little bit of money, and a couple pennies will roll back my way. And when I'm there at Home Gym Con, by all means tell me, hey, I used code VINTAGE, and I'll give you a high five. That's right, a free high five comes with it. All right, enough of that. Let's get to Eric, and let's learn a little bit about the history of arm wrestling. Eric Roussin, welcome to the show.
Thanks, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. So, where are you? You're up in Canada, correct?
I'm in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. That's correct.
Ooh,
it's cold. It's cold here, and there's been storms as well, but we didn't get it as bad as like the Midwest, or okay. Western Canada. It's very cold over there right now, but chilly, but not too bad. How about you?
Yeah, here in Pittsburgh, it's getting down there. Nothing crazy, no sub-zero weather, but just enough for, school cancellations and stuff like that for my kids, all that type of stuff. So, but hey, we went sled riding today. It's fun. I'll take it. But the reason that I invited you on, though, is not the weather in Canada. It's because you are quite the historian of arm wrestling. And did I get the name correct? Is it the Facebook group Arm Wrestling Archive?
Yeah, it's the Facebook page. It's also okay. The name of my website, the armwrestlingarchives.com. On Facebook, it's just the Arm Wrestling Archives.
Okay, yeah. Cool. So listeners, if you're enjoying what you hear on this episode, head there, and I'll remind you at the end of the episode as well. I met Eric fairly recently at Heavy Hands, a grip competition, and we just kind of talking in between events, that kind of thing. And you mentioned arm wrestling and how you had, gained access to some of these resources and some of these different sources of, evidence of the history of arm wrestling. So to start out, what I'm not really that knowledgeable on would just be the organization of it. Like right now, 2023, how is it organized? How is a champion declared? What's the setup, if you will?
Right. So a lot of it has changed actually since the pandemic. Traditionally, the past 50 years of arm wrestling has been dominated by tournament arm wrestling. So double elimination tournaments by weight class, by arm. That's sort of been the standard. So there's in Canada, there's provincial championships. In the States, most states have a state championship. There's a national championship, and ultimately there's a world championship. There's two sort of recognized world championships, but those in both cases they're considered amateur in that there's no cash prizes. The level is definitely professional. I mean, to win a world championship is not an easy task. But it's separated from the professional stream, which in recent years had been dominated by these super matches. And that's what a lot of people who may have been exposed to arm wrestling in the past few years are more familiar with. So there's the East versus West series and the King of the Table series. Those are the two leading organizations right now. And those are by invitation. They invite the very, very best pullers in the world, and they have them face off, not in a double elimination format, but a 3 out of 5 format. And they're taking from the people who have already won world championships, so the people who have really already through their careers have built up a very, very impressive resume. And then they have belts or world titles in those organizations. And if you win one of those are actually harder to win than a world title because that's actually prize money and everything else. So that's where you're going to see Devin Larratt. That's where you're going to see,
Gotcha.
Levon Teganashvili, all those big names.
Yeah.
They won a lot of tournaments in the past, but now they're professional arm wrestlers. They compete for prize money at these huge events and that are pay-per-view. So the sport has really exploded. Like many smaller sports have exploded since the pandemic, because I think a lot of people discovered it via YouTube. And so there's actually, pre-pandemic, there wasn't really much of a fan base. The fans were arm wrestlers and their friends and family. But now the sport actually does have a following, which is great. So that's really the two distinctions right now.
So there's a divide between world champion and then, it sounds like you don't officially go pro, but basically you're going that track.
Yeah, exactly. So the only people, a lot of people will say they're a pro arm wrestler, but the only real pro arm wrestlers in my mind are the guys who make a significant portion of money doing it. Do you have a day job? In North America, we have a tendency to say we're pro pullers if we're like at a competitive level. Like if you're like national level, you probably consider yourself a pro arm wrestler, even though you're paying to do it. Very few, the very top people make money. The rest of us, we're lucky if we cover our expenses. For most of us, we're actually, spending it to do it, like all the small sports, so. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned a name that, even having little knowledge of arm wrestling, I know Devin Larratt, and I know him because of his YouTube videos and Juji Mufu and all these things. So I would imagine too, once you get to that level, you can start branching out to other revenue streams and, other kind of ventures, if you will.
He's by far the most popular, well-known arm wrestler in the world. So yes, once you get to that level, a lot of doors open for sure. But there's only a few who can get in anything close to that, right? Yet.
Sure. So then the things you just mentioned, can we take a step back? Like, how long have those organizations been around? How long has the East First West and these things you just mentioned been around?
Yeah.
You mentioned like since COVID, it's taken off, but I mean, prior to that, what was happening?
Yeah. So these came about during the pandemic. Basically.
Oh, wow. So this is recent. This is just last 3 years. So
what happened is, for a few years there, you couldn't organize tournaments. Legally, we couldn't. There were no gatherings. So Engin Terzi, who runs East versus West, and he's one of the best arm wrestlers of all time, and he's won tons of world championships. He's in Turkey, and he started organizing a few sort of invitation, small gatherings, and he sort of started it. And then King of the Table, which is owned by Larry Wheels and a few other people. They started doing something similar, and they're all working together. And so that's very much, it was born out of the fact that there were no tournaments. And they said, I think they probably realized this is sort of the time to, noticing that the sport is becoming more popular on YouTube. So let's try this super match. What I call super matches is a 3 out of 5 challenge format. That's what they decided to focus on. So small events, only 10 or 12 athletes. And that format existed before, but it was not the dominant form.
So then
now it really is.
So then the World Championship prior to COVID how did you get to that? Was that just an event that you show up for? Were there qualifying tournaments leading into it or something?
Yeah. So the two leading world organizations, you have to place generally top 2 at your nationals in your class. Okay. Then you get qualified to go to the Worlds, and then you go to the Worlds, and those are big events now. They attract well over 1,000 athletes, so it's big week-long affair. Tons of different weight classes, age groups. So
sounds fun.
That's the standard. The standard process is you do well at your regional level, go to nationals, place top 2, then go represent your country at Worlds.
Now, how far back does Worlds go? Are we talking like 1980s, 1990s?
So, this was the problem in the early history.
Yeah.
So, organized arm wrestling as we know it, maybe I'll start a little further back.
Sure.
In the 60s, in the mid 50s in California, Petaluma, California, there was a challenge match by 2 local people who were like, "Oh, I think I'm the best. Let's settle it." So in a bar, and it got the attention of a local reporter, and he covered the match. And there was a small gathering, but everyone thought it was a lot of fun, so they decided to do sort of like a tournament every year. And between the mid 50s and the early 60s, the tournament really got popular. They used to be called the championships of Northern California, then California, and then basically it got so big they decided, let's just call it a world championship, because they weren't aware of any other tournaments going on. Let's just call it the Worlds. So 62, the World Wrist Wrestling Championship, which they called it, ran throughout the 60s. And then the big thing that happened is they managed to get a deal with ABC, Wide World of Sports.
Wide World of Sports.
To come film it. And they filmed the 1969 event. It aired in 1970. And that's when the sport really took off, because until that time, no one really realized that arm wrestling tournaments existed. All of a sudden, 35 million Americans discover it, that exists. And that in the 70s, a whole bunch of organizations formed, and every single organization either held a national or world championship. So in some years in the 70s, if you wanted to travel, you could probably win 8 world championships in a year.
Nice.
So it was really the Wild West in that time.
That reminds me kind of like old time strongman, and just sort of, if you want to be the world's strongest or strongest on earth, you just kind of declare that and have to defend that every time someone challenges you. Yeah. So it reminds me of the competing, or even just to bring it more recently, the multiple Mr. Americas that existed by different organizations, that kind of thing.
Exactly. So what happened by the end of the 1970s, there was one organization called the World Arm Wrestling Federation, and that was the first sort of true world championship in 1979, because there were 4 countries. Everything else was just Canada and maybe just the US and maybe some Canadians. In 79, there was an event, Canada, US, Brazil, Japan. And that was recognized as the first true worlds. And that organization is the one that became the leading world organization that still exists today.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And whenever I was just kind of punching into Google, no deep research here, but just punching into Google history of arm wrestling, ABC Wide World of Sports, you can see clips, in the thousands probably online of the various arm wrestling matches. And it makes me think of kind of the way powerlifting started to get televised occasionally, and the way strongman, World's Strongest Man, made it over to North America and started getting televised and things like that. Just the exposure of it. So then when it comes to this development, I have a very important question for you from one of my good friends and followers, the No Wine Cellar. I put it out there on my Instagram. Hey, does anyone want me to ask anything about the history of arm wrestling? And this right out of the gate. With everything you've said, how realistic is the movie Over the Top?
The Over the Top, it was such a big thing for the sport. And what many people may not realize is that the background footage in Over the Top is an actual tournament. It just so happened that the person who was hired to do some of the promotions for the movie was also an arm wrestler. And they managed to convince Canon Films, the company that made that movie, saying, you know what, why don't you get some realistic footage? Why don't we just host a tournament? It'll drum up publicity for the movie, and you'll have some realistic scenes. So that event happened in 1986, and it was by far the biggest tournament ever. And to this day, it is still the biggest tournament in terms of the prize, because like in the movie, the winner won a semi truck. So that was a huge prize.
So that was true. Like, it happened in real life. Like, you got a semi truck.
That was true. And
oh my gosh!
I don't know if you know who won the truck in real life.
I'm guessing John. I'm going to screw up his last name. Brzenk.
John Brzenk. John Brzenk. That was his first. Okay. He was 22 at the time. Mm-hmm. In his late teens, early 20s, he was already, he was making a statement. He was beating a lot of people. But when he won that event, basically since that was his mark on the world. Like, I'm here. Wow. So there was actually 2 divisions in that tournament. There was the pro division that had the bulk of the professional arm wrestlers, and that was for prize money. Then there was the truckers division. So you had to be either a trucker or like a Teamster member, and somehow John Brzenk had become a member of the Teamster Union, so that
So he got in on that side.
On that side, which had fewer professional arm wrestlers. There were some,
man.
but the field was
Genius.
a bit easier. And then he won that, and he won the truck. So yeah.
Oh, that's great. Because this was a while ago. I'd seen a documentary about him. It was just one of those deals where I was flipping through like Amazon Prime streaming and just looking something, I'll just admit it. I didn't even watch the whole thing. I watched maybe 20 minutes of it. So I loosely knew of this man, John Brzenk, but I knew he was considered like one of the GOATs, one of the greatest arm wrestlers. And then I saw a picture of Sylvester Stallone and him and realized, oh, he's in the movie. He's in Over the Top.
Yeah,
so
the guys
there it is.
The guys who won their classes all had cameos in Over the Top. So
oh, nice.
That's why. So a lot of the background, if you see them in the background, it's probably because they won the tournament or they did well in the tournament.
Oh, I'm gonna go back and watch it now. And this marks multiple episodes in a row of Home Gym History where we talk about Sylvester Stallone. So my last episode was with Trainer to the Stars, if you will, Gunnar Peterson, and he had trained Sylvester Stallone for some of the Rocky movies, and I had been talking with him about what's it like training Stallone. So, but that was well after Stallone filmed Over the Top. These were the later Rocky movies.
Okay.
But still, it's we've talked Stallone quite a bit on this podcast. So you now are part of the Stallone greatest hits. We'll do a clip show sometime in the future. We'll do a clip show that's just all the segments about Stallone on Home Gym History, and you'll be in there. So as far as going back further, I really love looking into old time strongmen, and just I'm in the middle of a book about Eugene Sandow right now. I just did a episode of my other podcast, Lift History, about Louis Cyr, and I just find it fascinating, and kind of the intrigue of what's real, what's not, the performance aspect of their lives. And you had commented on that episode of Lift History about Louis Cyr that his opponent, the episode was all about his last match, basically, is what I was talking about. And his last match, I probably butchered the young man's name. What is the young man's name that he was against?
Hector Decar.
Decar. Okay. I think I pronounced it like Decar. Well, anyway, so Decar, and you had commented that he was a formidable arm wrestler. So can you talk to it a little bit? Like I guess my question is, what role did arm wrestling play in that era, the turn of the century? We're getting into the 1900s, leading up to like vaudeville and the performance strongman. Where did arm wrestling fit into that?
So I've spent a lot of time researching arm wrestling history because there's very, very little. Before that I got into this, very little was documented. It's a sport. I'm convinced that arm wrestling, the actual motion, the activity, likely independently evolved in different parts of the world. I think that's sort of a safe assumption. I know for a fact that it existed for at least several hundred years in Hawaii.
Nice.
In Japan, and at least going back to the 18th century here in Quebec, French Canadian culture.
Okay.
In terms of organized matches, sort of like organized arm wrestling with rules, I've found a lot of information on the turn of the century, early 1900 to 1920 in Canada, in Montreal specifically. It was all documented in the newspapers, the matches coming up, what the rules are, what the bets are. It was very much, and those were not tournaments; those were super one-on-one formats. So he's
very much like the strongman match, where it was, because that's one thing I loved about that article that I was referencing on the episode of Lift History, is that it laid out that, they weighed the weights and they did this, and these are the rules, and this is these are the seconds that help you with your weights. It was all very like on the level compared to what people normally do, which is sling mud at and insults at old time strongmen and say, oh no, they cheat. So in that same fashion, arm wrestling matches took place between people where it was advertised.
Advertised in the local newspaper, challenges were issued through the newspaper, and normally there would be sort of one guy or a couple of guys who were recognized as the top guys, and people would challenge them. Often they'd bet money, or their supporters would bet money. I'm going to compare it to today's dollars. Most of these bets were for close to $1,000 in today's dollars. Back then it was $50 or $100, but in today's dollars, that's what it represented.
We're not at the penny
and
slot machines here.
Generally, it was 3 out of 5. And then some of the things they discussed was, one of the things was the distance between the elbows. So on a standard arm wrestling table, there's a standard dimension that has a certain size, certain position. But back then, I guess they put spots on the table to say where you have to plant your elbow. And when it's those who favored a short distance between the elbows were generally stronger arm inside pullers, versus those who preferred further apart, they were more outside top roller. So it's different strengths for different hands. So they would agree, okay, we're going to do it from 15-inch difference. Okay, we're going to do 2 out of 3, or we're going to do 3 out of 5. Okay, will there be time limits on the matches? So all of these rules had to be settled. The bet had to be settled, and then they would go at it. And if you won, then you would have the title and wait for the next challenger. And what happened is Hector Decar in 1902. He was at that point, he was training strongman. He didn't really arm wrestle, but somehow a match got set up between the recognized champ and him, and he beat that guy. This guy who had arm wrestled like 50 opponents and never lost, and all of a sudden Hector beats him. And then what does he do? Hector basically retires from arm wrestling.
He's going out on top.
Yeah, he's not accepting any matches because
that's awesome.
He says, and it's probably quite true, he was training for strongman. It's more lucrative, more attention, but also probably didn't want to risk losing. So when he actually faced Louis Cyr in the strongman contest in 1906, he was declared as the world arm wrestling champion because he had never lost the title.
I was just going to say that was probably a feather in his cap. That was probably, whenever they, just like at UFC or boxing matches nowadays, they kind of read off, 2-time champion, blah, blah, blah. Back then, that was probably right on his card, world arm wrestling champion, Hector Decar. So then when it comes to that, listeners, if you don't know, I'm not going to rehash the entire episode of lift history that I'm talking about, but Louis Cyr, if you just Google like who was the strongest person who ever lived, I guarantee Louis Cyr comes up at least a majority of the search results. He's just considered one of the strongest to ever live, and his very last match was against this young man, Hector Decar, who we are speaking of. So Hector Decar, then Louis Cyr, spoiler alert, he kind of it ends in a draw, but he cedes the title because the crowd, it'd be like if you paid top dollar to go to like the most marquee like boxing match, UFC, whatever it is, and it was a draw. Like you'd probably be disappointed. Like what? Like I came to see a champion. So then Louis Cyr cedes his title as strongest man on earth to Hector.
Right.
So then when it comes to arm wrestling, what you said, something that sticks out to me about this whole scenario is that this isn't just a matter of finding two strong guys and two strong people and saying, okay, as a promoter, I'm going to put these two together and people will pay to come see them, because there is some strategy and knowledge of the sport involved there. If you're talking about distances and this type of arm wrestler versus this type, and that's all fresh and new to me. As someone who's never competitively arm wrestled, but that's what it communicates to me, is just that these matches were more than just a spectacle. It was a sport. There was strategy involved. So Absolutely. Then, heading forward from there, do we have any other known names that got into, at least in the strength world, known names that frequently arm wrestled or got into competitive arm wrestling, things like that you're aware of?
So arm wrestling in the Montreal area sort of died down in the early 30s, and between 1930 and I guess the mid 50s in California was sort of a dead period in terms of organized arm wrestling. I'm not saying that there weren't any tournaments, but they were not publicized, or as far as I can tell. Now in the 70s, there were some powerlifters who dabbled in arm wrestling. So people who, I don't know how much you know about powerlifters from that era, but Jim Williams, you know him from Pennsylvania. He had,
I know of him.
At one point had the world bench press record.
So he was an arm wrestler as well?
He arm wrestled.
I don't know a ton about him, but I have heard of him. I've done a fair amount of research into just my local area, Pittsburgh, and then by extension, Pennsylvania, the state of Pennsylvania. So I've come across his name at times, for sure.
he trained in the same YMCA where Bob O'Leary, who was one of the original founders of the World Arm Wrestling Federation, he was just trying to organize arm wrestling, and he said, Jim, why don't you try this? And the guy was, just his strength alone was overwhelming. So he would defeat everyone he would face. And then in 1971, Bob O'Leary, the organizer, came up with the idea, let's do a special match here. We'll have a tournament, but the highlight match will be for the North American Championship. Or actually, they may have called it a world title, but they invited Jim Williams, who had never lost, against Maurice Baker. Maurice Baker had legitimately won 3 world championships in a row in some of the earlier organizations. So he lived in Connecticut. He was by far the most, in those early days, recognized as the man to beat. So they said, okay, the actual arm wrestler who has the title against the super bench press powerlifter. It was 2 out of 3. And it went the distance. Mo Baker won 2-1. And he said, Jim, if I had your strength and my technique, or if you had my technique and your strength, you would never be beaten, basically. Mo Baker had arm wrestled thousands of people in his life, and he was legitimately the best arm wrestler. And for Jim to give him up that type of battle was an impressive thing. So he only arm wrestled a few years here and there, and
I asked.
It was really not his focus. I mean, he was the world record bench presser. So
sure. A little bit after that comes, in terms of powerlifting, comes Ed Cohen, and I had him on Home Gym History, and I asked him because he notoriously has humongous hands. And so I was curious about grip strength and arm wrestling. Have you ever dabbled in any of these things? And he, right away, he was like, no. I forget who he said. He said someone asked him to arm wrestle and that he felt like his arm was getting ripped off. And he was like, it's not worth it. Like his vision was so streamlined in terms of like, I'm going to break these records. I'm going to do these things with powerlifting that it was just not worth his time.
All of these strength sports, or every sport, is so specific.
Yes.
So no matter how strong, like you've probably seen the video, or I'm sure some of your viewers have seen the video of Devin Armour wrestling the mountain. Half door. Yeah. So, and a lot of people who don't know arm wrestling, they're like, how is this possible? Devin has been arm wrestling every day for 35 years, basically. And he's become so strong in that one motion. Of course, Devin could not compete with Thor in a strongman contest, but no matter what you do, if you do enough, you're not going to beat somebody if you're not in the sport, right? You're not at the top level for sure. So it's that's one of the things that's fun about arm wrestling. John Bouzic's a great example.
I do see a lot of crossover between grip and arm wrestling.
I mean,
grip and arm wrestling. So
if you have a strong
grip strength and arm wrestling, it seems like a lot of grip strength athletes also arm wrestle and vice versa. Maybe that's just my purview, but it just seems like it.
There's not actually that many who compete in both. There's me, there's Lucas Raymond. There are a few here and there, but there's no question that a strong hand will help in arm wrestling. That's for sure. Am I cutting out again?
That makes sense. I think we have a lag here because I can hear myself coming through like a minute later. So just pardon me if my questions are coming across a little broken. So what I was curious about, though, and it's no big deal, but what I was curious about was, in terms of competing in arm wrestling, what kind of training do you need to put in? Let's say someone's listening that's, working out for health and for wellness, but not really competitive in a strength sport. And they're thinking, oh, maybe I'll try to compete in arm wrestling. How do you even start? Like, you just look for local tournaments? What do how do you go about it?
The best thing to do is to find a local club. So arm wrestling is to the point now where almost every city either has a club or within a short distance, but you definitely want to arm wrestle people who know what they're doing, because that's when you learn how to arm wrestle safely. It can be a dangerous sport if you don't know what you're doing. So number one, before you enter a tournament, try to find a club and learn how to pull. You'll get a lot of strength gains just learning how to pull properly with a team. There are a lot of exercises you can do as well, but the very best is to actually arm wrestle. And the first couple of, it's a hard sport to break into because it is painful, because you're using muscles and tendons in a way that is not sort of you use in day-to-day manner. So it is, you have to be okay with pain because the first few months can be tough. But eventually your body sort of gets used to it and, it gets better. But definitely try to find a club. Go into Google, go into Facebook, type your city, type arm wrestling, and you'll find.
Nice. That's great advice. What about you, though? How did you get into arm wrestling?
So I got into arm wrestling when I was 19. So in high school, there was an annual tournament, and I did well. I always won that tournament. And then I found out that there was actually a tournament in town. And I went and I spoke to the organizer, and he invited me to weekly practices. So that's how I got into it. This is pre-internet. So you had to sort of luck into it back in those days. Get connected, because once you're connected, then you get on the mailing list and get the flyers so you can hear about the tournaments. Now with the internet, you just have to search and you'll find. So it's a lot easier now. Basically, I got into it because as a kid and as a teenager, I was always good at it, and I liked it because I was good at it. So then I decided to see, how can I do against actual arm wrestlers?
And in terms of competitive arm wrestling, what's your resume like? Like, what have you gone about? What kind of goals do you have for the future? Are you still competing now?
Yeah, arm wrestling. So that was my only sport for 20 years, from the mid 90s to maybe 2000, early 2010s. I got to sort of a good national level arm wrestler. I won a national title, got the podium multiple times. I've won some decent regional sized events. Never quite the world level, but early 2010s, I discovered grip contests. So for several years, I was doing both. And eventually, after 20 years of arm wrestling, I was starting to feel it in my elbow. So it was starting to be, pain that I didn't have when I was in my teens and 20s and early 30s was sort of catching up to me. And I wouldn't get that pain from grip contests. So I've sort of switched gears, and I haven't arm wrestled. I haven't officially retired, but I last competed in 2022. I did a few tournaments, but I felt I lost a lot during the pandemic because I wasn't doing any arm wrestling. And it's hard to all of a sudden not be at the level that you used to be. And it's not that I couldn't get back there, but it would take a lot of effort. And things are going so well in grip sport. And I'm traveling all around the world with that. So that's sort of become my focus more recently.
And listeners, you probably know that I've, the past year or two, gotten into grip sport myself. But if you don't know, Eric organizes King Kong, which was so much fun. I hosted here in Pittsburgh for King Kong of Grip, and it just came out on the Grip Show. Great podcast. I want to say maybe a couple weeks ago, by the time this episode of Home Gym History drops, next year's King Kong events. So I'll put in a plug right now. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. And if you don't know much about King Kong, you can go to the Grip Show and learn about it. You can go to Eric's website and learn about it. And you can go to the Grip Board and learn about it. Just Google King Kong of Grip and it's bound to come up.
Yeah, and that King Kong, I know we're getting off arm wrestling history.
Sure.
But one of the beautiful things, in arm wrestling, you have to be in the same room with your opponent. That's how arm wrestling works. But for a grip contest, we're just lifting weights. So King Kong is a grip contest held in at least 30 locations around the world, where we're all competing on the same events on the same day. And then we compare results. So then that's how you get to compete with people, in Finland and in Chile and all over the world. So it's a lot of fun. And anyone who wants more information, just connect with me through the Grip Board or Facebook.
Yeah, and listeners, feel free to ask me as well. And if you're near Pittsburgh, I've already told Eric that I'm hosting again next year. It'll be in October. So October 2024. If you want to check it out and you're near Pittsburgh, just hit me up and you can visit my gym and see how you do. And I had, let's see, I had two different competitors at my gym for King Kong this year that had never done grip before. And then I also had two competitors that were light years ahead of me in terms of experience. So it was a really fun time because on one hand, I'm kind of gotten my feet wet so far competing, but it was cool to learn from those more experienced competitors, but also be able to help out and kind of enjoy seeing someone, look at this stuff for the first time and try it for the first time was just fun. So it was great. It was a good atmosphere, great competition. And then, like you said, seeing how you rack and stack against people all over the world was really fun. But in terms of the local clubs, that's great advice for the arm wrestling. But then I do see some people training at home, and I'm wearing a Arm Assassin t-shirt right now. You mentioned Luke Raymond, world champion arm wrestler, and he has produced various tools and implements and things for arm wrestling as well as grip and other things through Arm Assassin. Listeners, at the top of the show, you heard me, put a plug out there for Home Gym Con. I'm very excited. Luke's coming to Home Gym Con. Arm Assassin will be there in April. So if you're coming to Home Gym Con and you're kind of curious, like, wait, what are these guys talking about? Like tools and stuff I can use, to train for arm wrestling or train for grip at home. Visit Arm Assassin's booth in French Lick at Home Gym Con, and I'm sure they will set you straight. They'll have lots of cool stuff there to show you. But back on track with the history of things, I was curious with your history. So you got into it and you're competing in arm wrestling. You're starting to feel some pain, so you get away from it. But looking back on it, was it the national title? Was there anything that really stood out to you as like, that was your goal and you got it, or something you thought, wow, like this will go down in, kind of the stories I tell my grandkids?
Yeah, winning your first open division national title, that was big, for sure. And actually, one of the guys who was in my class had actually won the world championship a year and a half before. So I beat a world championship at nationals, so that was
nice.
Pretty cool. And then there was a big organization, professional organization in 5-10 years ago called the World Arm Wrestling League. And they held a series of regional tournaments in 2017, and I won one of those regional tournaments. That was also a big accomplishment because those events, attracted strong field. So to win one of those, that was definitely one of my favorite accomplishments in the sport.
Yeah, that sounds very cool. And I mean, those, I'm not saying it lightly. I think those are kind of the stories you would tell your grandkids. You beat a world champion on the way to a national title. That's cool. So as far as the history of arm wrestling, when I loosely just kind of looked into it so that I'd have a little bit of footing for this interview, right away, a lot of websites we're talking about like ancient Egypt, Middle Ages. Have you ever dabbled into, taking a look at, were ancient people actually arm wrestling, or fast forward in time a little bit to medieval times, were people in, medieval Europe actually arm wrestling?
So that is very hard to research. Because there's so little that is written about it and so little that is available in English. However, a few years ago, I collaborated with someone who was into this stuff as well in Russia, and he had basically, his mission was to determine what proof is there that there was arm wrestling. A rumor that was spread at some point was that there was in an Egyptian tomb, there was hieroglyphics showing two people arm wrestling. Well, he looked into this, and it doesn't depict that at all. Like it depicts maybe two people like touching hands in a dancing position. So basically, one person misinterprets it, the rumor spreads. So that's what you often hear. All it dates back to Egyptian. And it's not to say that it doesn't. Maybe there was arm wrestling, but that's not proof. Like that is. So, as I said, the only ones where I've actually found proof for several hundred years in Japan. I found sources and depictions and all that. several hundred years in Hawaii, and several hundred years in Quebec.
Mm,
That's where I know for sure. There's a
okay.
lot of talk about how it was introduced from the natives in North America to the English the settlers. I
Okay.
haven't found much. I found a lot of other types of combats or activities, but I have not found actual arm wrestling. So it's very murky. It's very hard to research. So there's a lot of, as I said, I think it
Sure.
probably has been practiced around the world as an activity for fun,
Mm.
but it's not documented and it's very hard to prove. So most of my research is from the 20th century onwards because of that I have access to newspapers and newsletters and a lot more data and information.
Yeah, sure. Well, have you found with the different areas that you just mentioned, Japan, Quebec, where you do have proof, you have newspaper articles of matches and things, although it would be quite a while until the world championships happened and people from those places were there, have you found proof of any contact between those people prior to the world championships? You know, like a Japanese arm wrestler that was at a match in Quebec, you know, or a Canadian that was, you know, over here or writing a letter to so and so.
Not before the 1960s.
Wow.
So
Okay.
yeah, I'm not to say that it didn't happen,
Yeah, but
and
just
that's what my Russian colleague, he was convinced that this is what must have happened. Is somebody saw it and brought it to another part of the world, and
yeah, yeah.
but I really think it's a basic test of strength. That is, I'm not
Mhm.
surprised. I can easily believe that it evolved independently in different parts of the world. So
Well, off the top of my head, I also see arm wrestling as always having kind of been in my life just you're passing time. You got nothing to do. You're hanging out together. You don't need a lot of room. You don't need a lot of equipment. You don't need a lot of anything, you know, a flat surface basically. And you can, you know, not by competition standards, but you can just in
right.
a, you know, friendly way with a pal, hey, you want to arm wrestle? So
Yeah.
I could see what you're saying to be true that maybe they did develop in separate areas up until the point of the world championships. You know, it's something people
Yeah.
came along with.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when it comes to the styles,
Sorry,
the
I can't. Sorry, I
go ahead.
can't add that. I do know that around the turn of the 20th century, in my newspaper research, I can definitely see it spread from Quebec to the northeastern states. That I've
Oh,
seen.
okay.
That I've seen articles where this sport was just introduced from this person from
Yeah.
Quebec, and so that spread I have been able to determine. But beyond that, it's hard to see how the spread exactly.
Yeah. Well, a kind of a classic old time strongman um, shtick, if you will, for lack of a better term, or like, you know, money maker would be kind of like Thomas Inch saying, hey, if anyone can lift this dumbbell, you get this money.
Right.
Or any other kind of strongman saying, if you can do this, you get this money. Is there any evidence or have you read of any arm wrestlers doing that, saying, hey, if you can beat me in arm wrestling, you know, pay 10
So
bucks. If you can beat me, you win the money.
I'm sure it's been done. I know that was a popular gimmick in professional wrestling in like the 50s and 60s. Some of these wrestlers were legitimately strong,
Yeah.
so they would open it up to the crowd saying, "Can any of you beat me?" I don't know how many takers there were, or how serious it was, but I have read of some wrestlers who are known for their strength who would actually do those types of challenges.
Yeah.
But I'm sure it happens all the time that we just don't hear about it.
Yeah.
But I've heard Dave Patton, who was one of the best lightweight arm wrestlers of all time. In the 80s and 90s, he was most active, and he would in New York City. He's known to set up a booth and just say, "Beat me, win $100." And of course, and he only weighed 150 pounds, but he beat everyone.
Oh,
Like
wow.
he was basically
Yeah.
John Brzenk, just a smaller version. So yeah, but historically, beyond the wrestlers that I've heard about, I don't know, but I would not be surprised.
Hmm. Now, I mean, you've piqued my curiosity here. I would, I've got enough pursuits. I'm really gotten very serious about my grip training. So I'm not saying I'm going headfirst into arm wrestling, but yeah, I've gotten curious enough that I want to maybe try or go out to, see. I guarantee you, like you said, there's probably a club in Pittsburgh. So injuries. What do I need to be scared of? What do I need to be not scared, but cautious of?
Well, the most common and the most dramatic is the arm break, and that's almost always it's a spiral fracture of the humerus bone. So your arm's going this way, your body's sort of twisting, and it's a spiral fracture. It's not a nice break, and that's why it's important to learn how to arm wrestle, to stay in positions. It's a dangerous. The common dangerous position in arm wrestling is when you're twisting away from your hand. So you're looking away, and your hand becomes aligned with your shoulder blades. That's a very dangerous, takes a lot of pressure on the humerus bone. So you learn to stay away from that position.
So you want to stay in, don't turn away.
You always want to stay square.
Okay.
Don't basically, if you're always thinking, look at your hand, that's what they tell beginners, look at your hand. It'll reduce the chance of you getting too far crooked. But basically, you want to stay square to the table as much as possible. So that is the sort of the scariest break. And the people it happens to the most are beginners. A, because they might not know how to pull yet, but B, oftentimes it's the bigger muscular guys because they're muscularly very strong, but they're not used to that torque in that angle. So it's almost like their arms, their strength, their muscles are too strong for their bones. Basically, their bones haven't gotten conditioned to the movement. So that's why it's if I get a new bodybuilder to the club, got to be very, very careful to show them, the practice in the club is there to learn. And it's hard for beginners, especially because if the first time you go to the club, you're going to want to see how good you are. You're going to want to have matches and you're going to want to test yourself.
Like the first time you picked up weights, I don't know about, I shouldn't speak for you, but for me, and I'm sure for a lot of people, you get in a weight room for the first time and you think, I wonder how much I can lift,
Yeah, exactly. So and it is a macho type sport. You want to see what you can do, but, and that's what you have to, it takes some time to teach new people that arm wrestling training is just that. It's training. It shouldn't be about ego. It should be about working positions, getting stronger in different angles, and but oftentimes it's hard to stay in that frame of mind. The good thing about arm wrestling is you're not going to get knocked out. You're not going to get head injuries or like that. Now, of course, any number of things can happen. I'm talking about worst case scenario, but like biceps, torn biceps, or tendons ripping off, any type of ligament. There's a lot of bad stuff that can happen, but I've been doing this since the mid-90s. I've had some minor things, but I've never had any major injuries. So I've been pretty lucky. So I think if you learn how to arm wrestle the right way, and you're just careful in your training, for the most part, it's a generally safe activity.
I mean, just about everything you've said the past couple minutes answering my question, I'm pretty sure anyone in any strength pursuit could apply that to their strength pursuit, whether it's powerlifting, strongman, whatever it might be. You need to learn the proper technique to keep it safe. And if you don't have the proper technique, whether you are hoisting a log over your head or deadlifting or doing whatever it is you're doing, you're probably going to injure yourself or get injured. So totally makes sense to me. So then to kind of wrap up here, it sounds like there's a pretty clear path if listeners are interested to try to find a local club. In person is best. If you're curious about some stuff for your home gym, Arm Assassin will be at Home Gym Con. You can check that out. You can go to their website. And then as far as King Kong, grip championship, I messed up the title here. Technically, King Kong of Grip. Is that what we are?
The actual title is the International King Kong Grip Challenge.
Thank you.
But
not championship.
If you win the overall title, you are recognized as the King Kong of Grip.
There you go. So that's what you're shooting for. You just have the entire world to compete against. So yes, listeners, if you're curious about that, you can contact Eric or myself. So Eric, I've got to ask before we leave, though, to kind of end on a a positive note, since we were just talking about horrific injuries that may happen. And I say may, like they probably won't happen as long as you're safe.
Right.
On a more positive note, why should people try arm wrestling?
It's a lot of, you know, as opposed to weightlifting, which I love, you're imposing your will on an opponent, right? So it's a test of wills. It's a mini fight. You're not going to get knocked out. So it's not, but you get a pretty big rush when you win an arm wrestling tournament or a match in a tournament. It's a very good feeling. And as you said, there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. You basically learn as you get into arm wrestling, you learn where you're naturally strong, where you might be a little more relatively weak, and then you can sort of work on bringing up your weaknesses or focusing on your strengths. And every arm wrestler, depending on their build and their genetic makeup, will be stronger in certain positions than others. So it's really, if you like to analyze your opponents, there's a lot of strategy involved. But the feeling of winning an arm wrestling match, hopefully everyone has experienced at least once in their life winning a match. It's a good feeling. So
Yeah.
I like to taste that. And when you get into the competitive arena, when you're actually, it's one thing to beat your friends who don't arm wrestle, but once you start beating arm wrestlers, it's a pretty good feeling.
It makes sense to me. I like that you called it the mini fight.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's very cool. Well, listeners, you can find more about King Kong if you just search it, like we had said. You can also go to Facebook and the Facebook page, the Arm Wrestling Archives that Eric runs if you want to dig more into the history of arm wrestling. Of course, you can find me at Vintage Weights PGH on all the platforms that you might find people on. And Eric, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Rob. It was a lot of fun.
All right. Take care.